Farnsworth. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Beneficial Electrification of Space Heating. We've just published the second in a series of 4 papers on beneficial electrification, and we want to share our major findings and conclusions with you today. Jim Lazar, Jessica Shipley, and I will be providing this presentation. If you'd like more information on today's presenters, their bios can be found on our website. Before we get started in earnest, let me explain a few housekeeping points. Because there are a bunch of you online today, we're going to keep you muted. You can submit questions, however, in the chat box, and we'll do our best to get to them. The webinar is going to run for 60 minutes, but we'll stay for an additional half hour if there are more questions. And finally, you should know that this webinar is being recorded so that others who are unable to attend today can also enjoy it. In a few days, we'll send you a link and the slides. So here's a roadmap to today's presentation. We're going to be discussing fuel choice, innovative technologies affecting the power sector, the test for determining whether or not an electrification investment is beneficial, and beneficial electrification strategies for space heating. Let me just start by giving you a quick sense of the perspective we're bringing to the topic today. When we consider space heating, we consider a project or measure to represent beneficial electrification if it meets one or more of 3 criteria without adversely affecting the other 2. Saves consumers money over the long run, reduces environmental impacts, and enables better grid management. Further on in today's presentation, we'll be looking more closely at each of these criteria. But first, let's get a lay of the land. There's a lot happening in the power sector today, and depending on your perspective, this disruption or this innovation, these opportunities offer many interesting choices, and would like you to consider some of them. Jim.
Thanks, Dave. Examining fuel choice has never been a simple task. In 1989 and 1990, I worked on a couple of studies on fuel switching. These studies found that converting customers from electric heat to gas heat would save consumers money and actually save natural gas, which was the swing electric generating fuel in the West at that time. Today's studies show a different result. So what's changed? Well, just about everything. In 1989, wind and solar were really not viable economic resources. The best heat pumps had pretty low efficiency. Heat pump water heaters were not commonly available, and the best natural gas generating plants had about 42% conversion efficiency. Today it's all different. Wind and solar are coming in at 2 and 3 cents a kilowatt hour. Modern heat pumps and heat pump water heaters are very efficient with COPs of 3 or better in mild climates, and improving results in cold climates. New gas generation is as much as 62% efficiency converting gas to electricity when the wind is not blowing and the sun is not shining. Modern technology can enable control of key loads. So the analysis is essentially the same, but the inputs have changed, and it should not surprise us that the conclusions have changed. A modern mini-split or multi-split heat pump can provide heating and cooling very efficiently. Millions of these are installed every month worldwide. This discussion is about space heating. This is a huge residential end use, over 1/3 of the total. This is a very significant opportunity for beneficial electrification. This opportunity is spread across the country. There is a lot of remaining potential in the South and very high potential along the West and East coasts. Jess?
Thanks. So before we talk about how electrification of space heating can be beneficial, we want to spend a few minutes talking about types of electric technologies and their different uses. So in developing our analysis, we needed to narrow the scope of technology types that we were looking at. So first, we looked at air source heat pumps, which move heat from outside air into the indoor space during the winter and move cool air from outside into the indoor space in the summer. These can be ducted, which means they circulate air through existing HVAC ducts in a building, or like in this photo, ductless, which means that the outdoor and indoor units are connected via a conduit that passes through a small hole in the wall. There are standard models which work well in most mild climates and cold climate models that are designed to work well even when the outside temperature falls down to around 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Air source heat pumps can be supplemented by a backup heating or storage option. This is useful if the outside temperature drops below the level where the heat pump is operating efficiently. And ground source heat pumps use the heat energy available in the ground and circulate it either via heated water or air into the house. And then lastly, electric resistance heating can be paired with thermal or electric storage to make it possible to store heating energy while power is cheap, and then release it as useful heat in the home when it's needed. So I mentioned air source heat pumps with supplemental heating. This can take many forms and does not necessarily mean maintaining a fossil furnace. It can be a propane room heater or fireplace insert, which both provide supplemental heat and an emergency heating source during a power outage. Or in places that have very cheap off-peak power, like the Plain States, it can be an electric ceramic storage heater, like the picture on the right. So climate is an important determinant of what types of electric technologies can work for space heating. This is NOAA's annual heating degree day map, which shows how heating requirements vary by region. States throughout the southern tier in the red, orange, yellow, and even the green areas of the country have relatively small heating needs, and these are the areas where heat pumps are already quite effective at meeting heating demands. And the northern tier of the country will require either cold climate heat pumps or may not be good candidates for electrification yet. And if we switch over to the cooling degree day map, we can see that the areas of the country I just talked about where heat pumps are likely to make sense for heating needs correspond quite closely with the areas where demand for air conditioning is high. Those areas, again, in red, orange, yellow, and green, have cooling as their dominant space conditioning need, and they're likely to have excess capacity on the power system in the winter months, thus can accommodate a shift to heat pumps for heating needs. Building type also affects technology choice. Apartments will have different considerations than single-family homes and manufactured housing. Things like space constraints or whether a ducted furnace already exists and options for sharing space heating needs. And the considerations for installing electric heating in new construction versus existing housing stock will be things like incremental upfront cost of technology choices, the thermal efficiency of the building envelope, and whether a connection to a fossil energy distribution grid already exists or could be avoided altogether. So the ultimate decision about what type of technology works best is a complex one. To summarize the considerations I've mentioned just for single-family homes, technology choices will vary depending on what the coldest outdoor temperature is. It will also depend on whether the home is new construction or not, and for existing homes, it will depend on what fuel is already being used to heat the home. So for example, in existing homes that use oil or propane to heat, in a milder climate like the Mid-Atlantic or the Southeast, an air source heat pump will be an ideal replacement technology. And as temperatures get colder, the energy efficiency of the building envelope will be a key determinant of what works. So perhaps a backup source of heating or going to a highly efficient cold climate heat pump. We can expand this chart to include apartments and manufactured housing, and similar kinds of factors affect the decision about what heating technology will work best for these housing types as well. We're not going to talk through this table, but we hope that it shows that there are electrification options for most of these circumstances and that the decisions about what works best will be complex and situation specific. I think I'm handing back to Dave.
Great, thank you, Jess. So before we look at the three conditions that I introduced a couple of minutes ago, let's just let me just check and see if there are any clarifying questions. So Jess, actually do have one. Looking back at the summary of technology considerations, would you say that the most important factors are climate and housing type?
Those are the two main considerations that we looked at in the paper, and they are certainly main drivers of what will work. There are other factors that will affect these decisions, and that's why we included some question marks in that table. That's because the analysis will be different for new and existing buildings and will depend on the efficiency of the building envelope, whether you're already connected to a fossil fuel distribution system like the gas utility. So there are other factors, but those are the two big ones that we looked at in this paper.
Thank you. Let's continue. In order to understand what beneficial electrification is, let's first be clear on what it is not. Even though we often hear people saying this, we don't think that it makes sense to electrify everything. As noted earlier, we consider a project or measure to represent beneficial electrification if it meets one or more of three criteria without adversely affecting the other two: saves consumers money, reduces environmental impacts, and enables better grid management. Let's look at each one of these criteria a little more closely. Jim?
Thanks, Dave. Saving consumers money in this context means that over its lifetime, the action results in a lower total cost to provide the end use, in this case, space heating. That's accomplished by looking over the long run, not the short term, including the cost of acquiring and maintaining the appliances, including consideration of any incentives that are provided to align the consumer interest with the public interest, and including utility bill savings from any time of use or ancillary services benefits that the measure can provide. There's several key factors in the consumer economics of electric heating. The efficiency of the appliances and the efficiency of the buildings makes a big difference. If space cooling is desired, then customers will be incurring the cost of a compressor system for space conditioning, and it should probably be a heat pump system of some kind. And finally, the cost of installation, the cost of fuel. The current economics of converting from oil to electric heat, according to this study from the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, are quite compelling in much of the country. But there are some areas in the northern tier where the economics do not yet work. In new construction, the Rocky Mountain Institute has done a study that shows an economic benefit for installing heat pumps under some circumstances in all of the 4 geographic regions they studied. This slide depicts Oakland, California. Installing natural gas heating with a new air conditioner was consistently more expensive for customers than the heat pump options. In retrofits of existing homes, here in Oakland again, the result is quite different. The electric options are all significantly more expensive than gas heat alone. That is, where there's no need for a new air conditioning unit, it's cheaper to stick with gas. But where a new AC unit is needed, the heat pump option becomes the more economic retrofit option. So the key to cost effectiveness may be a matter of timing. Let's leave Oakland, and I'll take you across the country to Providence, Rhode Island, where the weather is a little bit different. Even in Providence, the RMI study shows that in new construction, a heat pump was the best choice. This is largely due to the efficiency of the new housing stock being built. In retrofits, however, natural gas is still more economic at today's current prices and technologies in this cold climate. But heat pumps beat heating oil and propane. Future economics will be better. Heat pumps are improving. Natural gas prices are expected to rise faster than electricity prices. Electric resistance heat remains more expensive unless it can be fueled with low-cost off-peak power. That's not reflected in this graph from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Dave?
Thank you, Jim. Our second condition, reducing environmental impacts, means that emissions of the grid with the electrification measure are lower or cleaner than the emissions of the fossil fuels that are replaced in providing the consumer end use. Again, this is over the life of the appliance and taking into account the grid flexibility created through electrification. In our paper, we focus on CO2 emissions for clarity and convenience, but the same benefits also apply to criteria pollutants, toxic emissions, as well as water and land use. But let's think a minute about this important source of fuel. In 2016, we found out that the U.S. power sector had the same emissions that it had in 1993, but that it was also producing nearly 30% more power than it did in 1993. These are the results of factors Jim described, like more efficient generating resources, natural gas displacing coal, and the positive economics of wind and solar. This nationwide trend is illustrated in this figure, showing changes in MISO's power sector mix over the last 10 or so years. As you can see, the general trend is that coal is being edged out by gas and renewables. Now, knowing the general trend in fuel mix and average emissions is useful, but it's also important because electrification will add incremental load. It's also important to know the system's marginal emissions. In this figure, for example, we see that in PJM, between 2012 and 16, coal went from being on the margin about 60% of the time to about 45% of the time. We also see that natural gas has increased from about 30% to around 45%. Let's consider an example where we look at an oil furnace and a heat pump. Let's compare heat pump emissions to emissions from oil heat. In a Midwest location, an oil furnace will use about 500 gallons of oil per year and emit a little over 11,000 pounds of CO2 per year. The same home with a heat pump will use about 8,000 kilowatt hours a year. If the power is 50% coal and 50% natural gas, the emissions will be a little under 11,000 pounds. And most of the country has a power system that's cleaner than 50% gas and 50% coal. So in most places, the emissions advantage over oil heat will be significant. Now, in the prior slide, we considered pounds of CO2 per year. In this one, we want to illustrate space heating opportunities, and we'll use pounds per MMBTU of useful heat. So, depending on the appliance and the power system mix, there are going to be different levels of emissions efficiency. The red boxes are less emissions efficient than most efficient natural gas furnace, about 95%, which produces about 130 pounds per MMBTU. The green boxes, on the other hand, are more emissions efficient, and the orange ones are right on the cusp. Let me make one final point about emissions. Investment like heating appliances and residential buildings are long-lived. Consequently, opportunities for new investments are limited. Emissions effects of those investments will last as long as the investments themselves. So, unless utilities and consumers are positioned to make informed investments when it comes time to replace infrastructure, that opportunity to make lower cost and cleaner investments may be lost for a decade or more. Jess.
Great, thanks, Dave. So our third beneficial electrification condition is that it offers grid operators greater flexibility to better manage load and improve demand response and integrate higher levels of renewable generation into the system. And this can occur if some or all of that electrified load can be controlled by the grid operator, like through a smart thermostat, or if consumers themselves can program their loads to take advantage of time-varying rates. This graphic shows the annual load profile in Rhode Island from 2016. So this is all 8,760 hours in that year with the demand in megawatts on the y-axis. A similar chart could be produced for other states as well. The key thing here is that the top 1% of hours within the blue bar represent 9% of total spending or costs on the system, and the top 10% of hours within the red bar represent 26% of the spending. So if we can move usage away from those times that fall in the red bar or above, there are cost savings and grid management benefits that we can attain. And if electrified load can be flexible, it can have value because it can help us be more effective and more cost effective with our renewable energy production. So this slide illustrates the penetration of wind resources in wholesale power markets around the country. Those are the green dots. And the various levels of curtailment in the blue bars of those resources between 2008 and 2016. So across all 7 regions shown in the graph, which is the far right-hand side, total wind energy curtailment in 2016 was nearly 4,000 gigawatt hours, or roughly 2% of potential. And if space heating load can be flexible either by preheating, pre-cooling, or the utilization of thermal or electric storage, it can help us reduce curtailment and the waste of this renewable energy. The ability to control devices is a key to being able to capture the cost-saving and renewable integration benefits I just described. This illustrates an uncontrolled load profile where the various usages occur throughout the day. You can see the bright blue is the air conditioner coming on. The yellow line shows the output of the solar panel on the roof in this example. Flexible load can concentrate usage during hours renewable energy is available. So in this example, that means concentrating it during the middle of the day when the solar system is producing energy. The AC can be controlled to occur primarily during the solar day, helping to pre-cool the space and reduce the demand for the air conditioner during other times. And an analogous chart could be created for space heating, showing preheating or a storage heating device being charged up with off-peak wind power. A smart thermostat can help make all of this flexibility possible. I think back to Dave.
Thank you. I'm looking for any clarifying questions very quickly. Folks have submitted questions. We appreciate that. I think at this point what we'll do is move on and come back to these questions a little bit later. So let's shift gears slightly. We've just looked at examples of innovations and other changes in the power sector. We looked at RAP's test for beneficial electrification. Now let's talk about strategies. Beneficial electrification can be expected to interact with existing state policies. Therefore, it'll be very important to ensure where possible that these efforts dovetail appropriately with existing policies. There's an obvious connection between space heating opportunities and building codes. Let's consider a few here. New construction is really promising. It's an important opportunity. When buying a new home, homeowners are in a position to look at all the appliances they might choose. And there are economical choices that can be made, like installing heat pump technology for both space heating and cooling. A key aspect of making electrification work for space heating is making sure the building envelope is highly efficient. So continued improvements in that regard will naturally improve the economics of electrification. In the longer term, we think it makes sense to talk about how to improve codes that recognize and encourage high efficiency electric technologies. While certainly a challenge, perhaps in the long term, we could move towards codes that look at the overall energy efficiency of end uses or their emissions efficiency. At the very least, given the potential for energy and cost savings, it would be useful if code required new residential structures to be quote-unquote all electric ready. That is, built with an electric panel size to safely handle all the electric heating and cooling appliances that might be used by the homeowner, and with reasonably sufficient room to locate those appliances. Let's consider state efficiency resource standards for a minute. Now, these standards and program incentives are typically set up to require energy use reductions for electricity and other fuels separately, and they're denominated in therms or kilowatt hours, for example. Standards and programs structured this way may discourage electrification because they discourage increases in electricity use, even if those increases would produce overall decline in energy use. States could address this obvious barrier by including an electrification component, for instance, a carve-out in their efficiency policies, or by reformulating metrics for measuring the overall efficiency policy goals to reflect reductions. For example, primary energy use or greenhouse gas emission reductions. New York State, for example, recently adopted a statewide cumulative annual site energy savings target. It's set out in BTUs, and it'll incentivize the most cost-effective efficiency measures across all fuels. A final observation about state policy. As with other energy policies, states can expect energy affordability to affect the ability of all customer classes to share the benefits of electric space heating in an equitable manner. Low-income households typically have older and less efficient energy systems and appliances, and even more fundamental challenges associated with the thermal character of their housing stock. These households often lack the flexibility and resources to even consider improving the efficiency of their space heating and cooling options. For states to ensure that space heating and cooling programs are available to all energy consumers, programs will have to recognize these circumstances and determine how best to address this gap in affordability. Jim? You may be muted, Jim.
Thanks, Dave. To effectively implement beneficial electrification, we need to be reforming electricity rate design. At a high level, we think that rate design should make choices customers make to minimize their own bill consistent with the choices that they would make to minimize system costs. Going back to the graphic that Jess showed earlier, what we want to do is set up rates to entice customers to shift their usage away from high cost and high emission hours and into hours that fall below the red zone here. Those are the hours when the system actually has available capacity to serve load and prices are generally low. We've recently published Smart Rate Design for a Smart Future, which looks at a wide variety of rate design issues. The essence is to establish retail rates that accurately convey utility system costs as they vary through the day and across the seasons. I'll use the residential rate in Fort Collins, Colorado as an example of these smart rate design principles. The off-peak rate design is very cheap, under 7 cents a kilowatt hour. The on-peak rate design for just a few hours each day is much higher, over 20 cents. And Fort Collins has retained the conservation benefits of an inclining block rate by imposing a surcharge on all usage whenever it occurs that's above 700 kilowatt hours a month. A TOU rate does not necessarily mean a bill increase for a typical customer. Most customers have usage that varies through the day, with peak usage during the same period as the system peak. For a customer with 1,000 kilowatt hours of usage, a 10-cent flat rate will generate a bill for $100. A TOU rate that's a nickel off-peak and 30 cents on-peak will also generate a bill for $100 based on typical customer usage. But with the TOU rate, the customer has an opportunity to reduce their bill sharply by limiting usage during the peak hours. A 2-period TOU rate, depicted at the top here, encourages customers to preheat just before the peak begins and then coast through the peak, which is easy to do in a well-insulated home. It also encourages customers, however, to schedule discretionary uses, clothes washing, dishwashing, outside of the peak hours. For systems with both a morning and evening peak, shown here at the bottom, a TOU rate encourages customers to preheat both morning and afternoon. This graphic is from a RAP publication, Time Varying and Dynamic Rate Design. It shows the result of 109 different rate pilots. We found that time varying rates produced a 5 to 20% reduction in peak demands, and that critical peak pricing produced 10% to 40% reductions in peak demand. Rate design really works. Jess?
So the last thing we want to touch on are incentive programs. These programs give consumers a financial benefit for choosing a particular appliance. They're widely used around the country, run by utilities, sometimes state agencies, or third-party efficiency providers. And they could present barriers to beneficial electrification. So for one thing, they tend to only give an incentive for switching to a more efficient appliance that uses the same fuel. So if someone with a gas furnace, say, decides to get an efficient heat pump, they're only eligible for an incentive based on the difference between a standard heat pump and the more efficient heat pump, not the energy or greenhouse gas savings that could come from switching from gas to electric. And some programs even explicitly disallow fuel switching when getting an incentive. And most importantly, really, existing incentive programs might be working at cross purposes with achieving the benefits of electrification, like emission reductions or the largest possible consumer savings. For example, if there are incentives for consumers to switch within the same fuel, the fossil incentive could be drowning out any lifetime savings someone might see from switching to a heat pump. So that would neutralize any of the cost-saving benefits that might have existed from electrification. We're starting to think about how these barriers could be removed and instead have programs provide opportunities for beneficial electrification. With that, I think I'll hand it over to Dave for some final thoughts.
Thank you, Jess. So electrification can mean innovation and opportunities. And beneficial electrification is intended to be a framework to help you analyze those opportunities. So we recommend that you analyze for your state and region, try to identify promising opportunities and potential barriers. Consider launching pilots to prove technologies and to develop the market, supply chains, installer expertise, those sorts of things. This summer, ComEd, for example, issued an RFP and hired a contractor to create a turnkey pilot program to develop and learn about cold climate, ductless heat pumps, and building envelope measures for income-eligible customers in multifamily buildings. The sort of pilots that would help create a better picture of the opportunities that may be available in your region. Just a reminder to you all that RAP has just published the second paper in a series of 4 on beneficial electrification. Keep an eye out for subsequent publications on water heating and electric transportation in the next few months. And at this point, what we'd like to do is go to questions. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to run with these questions to just about the top of the hour, but we're game to continue for an additional 30 minutes if there are more questions. So with that, let's take a look at some of these questions. Jim, I've got one for you, but Jess, feel free to weigh in. Is there a thermodynamic quality issue using high quality electricity for low quality heat?
I had exactly the same question when we began looking at electrification, in part because of the work I'd done 3 decades ago on the benefits of converting people away from electric heat. And what's changed is low-cost renewable energy available in most parts of the world. Wind coming in at less than 2 cents a kilowatt hour that enabled Xcel Energy to make a decision for early retirement of a coal plant. Solar that has come in as cheap as 2.4 cents to Nevada Energy and 2 cents in other countries. It's a seismic shift in the cost of clean energy that makes using it in different ways than made sense just a few years ago pretty attractive. I kind of think of my previous attachment to thermodynamic efficiency as brilliant, but I think it actually was brilliant in 1990, but we live in a different world today.
Thanks, Jim. For either of you, what's being done by regulators to ensure that electrification efforts by IOUs must be beneficial?
Well, I think it's early days still for the implementation of specific beneficial electrification programs. There are some efforts in states like Rhode Island to work together with stakeholders to collaboratively agree on what metrics should be tracked to sort of determine what beneficial electrification is. Other states are having similar conversations. Minnesota, California will be worth watching as their IOUs are being tasked with helping the state meet carbon goals. And that's why we're setting out our, our 3 conditions for beneficial electrification. We think that regulators should consider those in implementing any evaluation of utility programs and pilots.
I'll just add very quickly that the Washington Commission had previously approved conversion programs from electric heat to gas heat, and those programs have now been halted while they're doing an evaluation of whether electrification is becoming more attractive and should be incented. But at least they've stopped the programs that went the other way.
Thanks, Jim. So were those programs based on the sort of analysis that you talked about doing at the beginning of this slide presentation back in 1989, 1990?
Yes, they were, and Avista Utilities was the first utility to launch such programs. But the Northwest Power and Conservation Council actually did a region-wide analysis that showed about 600 megawatts of electricity usage could be economically replaced with natural gas in studies that they did back, as I say, three decades ago. But everybody's reviewing the work that was done and reaching new conclusions today.
Thanks, Jim. Should regulators develop specific rates for heat pump water heaters like they have for EVs?
My own opinion is no. Our smart rate design, illustrative rate design, is attractive for EVs because it has a very low off-peak rate, as the Fort Collins rate that I showed has. And that rate works just fine for EVs. It also works well for people with other large discretionary loads, swimming pools, hot tubs, and controllable water heaters. And will also work well for providing a low-cost period to run space heating appliances. And if those space heating loads are not at the time of the system peak, it will save customers money to do that. If space heating loads are at the time of the system peaks, the economics are going to be different, and in those regions, a different strategy may be needed, such as storage heating, like Jess talked about.
Thanks, Jim. What are some methods to deal with the extended heating demand peaks, days or weeks, that can occur in areas such as the Pacific Northwest?
So in many regions of the country, not just the Northwest, there will be extended periods of heating need, and even during those extended periods, there will still be times when the grid is less sort of stressed than others. So the strategies that we talked about earlier in the webinar for taking advantage of the lower cost times and being able to avoid the very most peaky times will be important. So things like preheating during low demand hours or deploying electrical or thermal storage will start to make economic sense. Those technologies are available today. For really cold regions, supplemental heating to handle the coldest times may be needed. And Jim, do you have anything to add on that?
The other thing I'd add is that, yes, there will be some hours when we use fossil fuel electric generation to support these things, and there will be a very few hours, a few cold hours every year in many regions that we talk about in the paper. But if we're using efficient natural gas generation to fill in for wind and solar in a relatively small number of hours of the year, the overall energy use and emissions of electric heat using efficient heat pump technology will be lower than direct heating with natural gas, at least in the milder climate regions.
Thank you. What do you propose for converting gas heating in residential housing with inadequate electric service at reasonable cost?
Well, I'll take a crack. I think the short answer is that we don't propose converting to electric heating where there are unreasonable costs. So something like upgrading the electrical panel to handle more household load would certainly add cost to retrofit. It might make it too expensive to make sense based on our three-part test, the consumer cost effectiveness part of that test. So hopefully that is clear in the way we set out that definition of beneficial electrification. Jim, do you have anything to add?
Well, as we discussed in the webinar, electrification where new appliances, a new air conditioner is needed, that's a good time to put in a heat pump. In low-income housing with inefficient building shells and older appliances, the economics are going to be much worse. As Dave said early on, not all electrification is beneficial. In those low-income housing situations, the first focus should be on the efficiency of the building shell itself. But in New Zealand, they had a low-income weatherization program during the economic recession starting in 2009 that set out to weatherize all low-income housing in the country. They installed heat pumps in many of those homes as part of that program. And in addition to producing cost-effective savings on the energy side, they also produced a 43% reduction in hospital admissions due to respiratory ailments from the occupants of those homes. So there was a very significant non-energy benefit of the electrification that took place at that time in New Zealand. And considering the non-energy benefits is an important part of looking at the overall system benefit of electrification.
Thank you both. Regarding emissions, did you consider the energy loss during generation, transmission, distribution to the electric grid to do your analysis? As part of that, I would say yes. I'm going to ask Jim to fill in the specifics. We assume that on average there are line losses of 2 to 3%, and on the margin there could be line losses of as high as 10 or so percent. But we did consider those. Jim, could you add to that?
You know, a lot of what we presented came from NREL, Rocky Mountain Institute, and ACEEE, and those studies that we relied heavily upon all did take the generation, transmission, and distribution losses into account. They vary by region, they vary by time of day, and at peak periods, line losses, marginal line losses, going to be very, very high on some systems. And those studies all took that into account. It is certainly important to take that into account, but it is also important to take into account the compressor loads for moving natural gas through the pipeline system, or the pipeline and trucking energy requirements to move propane and heating fuel. And I'm not sure anybody has done an adequate job on that side. And it's not necessarily as high a percentage as for electricity, but it's not zero.
Thanks, Jim. Do the economic benefits incorporate incremental costs associated with updating electric infrastructure to manage increased loads?
That has mostly, in the studies that we relied on, not been considered very much, because in most parts of the country, loads are stable or even declining. So the infrastructure generally has enough capacity. The exception is, and one of the reasons that the electrification failed in the cold climates, is that the infrastructure would require upgrading, and that's not cheap.
Thanks, Jim. I would observe as well that one of the big changes that comes with electrification is the ability to move beyond prior conditions that were limiting on the power system. In other words, the requirement that you consume electricity at the same time it's generated. With that flexibility associated with many forms of electrification, you have the ability to move this electricity use to times of day that are cheaper and where there's less demand, and where you're putting less demand on a system. So I think that's important to recognize that there are opportunities here for managing this load or aggregating this load and managing large amounts of it in a way that's beneficial to the grid and doesn't require any more investment on the grid, but in fact takes advantage of the investments that have already been made. I refer.
Yeah, well, Jess showed in a couple of her slides the maps for heating degree days and cooling degree days, and the most attractive opportunities for electrification are in the southern tier states, and in those states the grid is usually sized to a summer peak for air conditioning demand and won't have capacity issues for some time if space heating loads are added to them.
Thanks, Jim. What are some of the challenges for small commercial buildings, and how different are these from residential challenges?
In small commercial spaces, residential air source heat pumps can be used if it's a quite small commercial building. If you get to a larger size commercial space like a school or a hospital, and a substantially larger unit is needed, then the costs and the technology options are going to be quite different. Commercial buildings are more likely to need air conditioning, so if they are already installing or replacing a compressor system, a heat pump is going to make sense. And then as for challenges, I'd say actually a similar challenge is that the efficiency of the building will play a big role in the effectiveness of the heat pump, and also depending on the climate. Also, I'd just point out that commercial buildings also use a lot more natural gas for cooking than residential buildings, and so that's an area that could pose some challenges but also opportunities for electrification in the commercial sector.
Yeah, in the water heating paper that we're working on, we address the heat pump water heater technology, which is a very attractive technology, for example, in restaurants that have both a large hot water demand and a large air conditioning demand. And so we'll touch a little more on commercial in that paper, but not so much in this one.
Thank you. Should a natural gas utility's existing infrastructure, in parens stranded costs, be considered in the cost effectiveness analysis? I assume the cost effective analysis we're talking about here.
I think those should be considered, but the most important time and place to consider them is in the integrated resource planning process. And I think we need to think about moving to a joint electric and gas integrated resource planning framework where we identify portions of the electric grid that are stressed where electrification is a not good idea, and areas where the gas grid is aged and perhaps in need of major renovation. And in those areas, electrification may be a good opportunity to avoid the costs of renewals and replacements on the gas grid. You can't know the right answer until you study the combined question of gas and electric options in a given service territory.
Thanks, Jim. Do you have examples of state or utility demand-side management policies that have successfully addressed this electrification disincentive, the electricity growth resulting from beneficial electrification? Well, I noted the New York policy. I don't know if either of you have other examples.
I know this is an active conversation in California as well. They're currently looking at the metrics for their programs and whether that should be revisited. I know there are a couple other examples. I can't think of them off the top of my head.
The California Energy Commission has launched a pretty significant set of changes to the state energy code, and among those are to be more enabling of electrification in California. They have done enough analysis to find that at 50% of space heating being electrified, the California grid swaps from being a summer peaking grid to a winter peaking grid. And at that threshold, then the question that came up earlier about the adequacy of the electric infrastructure would become important. But we're a long way from that threshold today.
Sorry, Dave, I remembered another example. In Massachusetts, their energy efficiency programs for their appliances, they have a new approach that's sort of fuel agnostic, and they actually also have numerical targets in place for deployment of air source heat pumps. So that could be an example to look at.
That's a good example. Is that the Mass Saves program?
I'm not sure of the name of it.
Okay, I think that's correct. This is a question especially for you, Jim. What do you think of a non-peak rate of 0 rather than, say, 5 or 6 cents? Seems that would send a stronger signal to the customer to shift their usage.
Well, we actually see that for the supply price in Texas and for the customers on real-time pricing in Illinois. There's still a distribution cost that's not 0. And then you run into different rate-making philosophies. I personally think that every use of the grid should contribute something towards the cost of the grid. So a 0 price would, in my opinion, be too low. But it's certainly debatable. There are marginal cost theorists who would take a different perspective. It's really not part of my training in economics to look at what's happening in Texas with the wholesale price going negative in the middle of the night, and a retail electricity provider being able to buy power at a negative price and then sell it for 0 and make money on the transaction. But that's actually happening, and TXU offers customers a choice of either free nights or free weekends in many of their pricing plans there. I heard on a webinar recently of electric vehicle owners on the real-time pricing program in Illinois being able to get their supply price to charge their vehicles to below 0. They're still paying about 3 cents a kilowatt hour for the wires, but that still works out to 30 cents a gallon of gasoline equivalent. So it's certainly a very enticing price. But 6 cents, the Fort Collins price of 6 cents works out to about 75 cents a gallon of gasoline equivalent, and that seems like a pretty powerful incentive to me.
Thank you, Jim. So we're getting near the top of the hour. So as quick a response on the following question as possible would be good. Is anyone doing benefit cost testing of these approaches versus natural gas and finding net benefits, or is it all versus propane and oil right now?
People are doing lots of analysis.
Yeah, there's a lot happening on this, and we cited a couple entities that are looking at net benefits of heat pumps versus natural gas. One example is the RMI study we talked about. NREL as well is projecting that pretty soon after 2020, we see heat pumps reach cost parity with natural gas furnaces at the national average level. Certainly, a lot of low-hanging fruit for cost-effective electrification does exist in oil and propane conversion for space heating, but there are analyses going on the natural gas side as well.
Yeah, and the attractiveness is going to be in new construction. In new construction, choosing a heat pump is going to be very attractive throughout the southern tier and up the 2 coasts as compared to natural gas, because you avoid the entire natural gas infrastructure cost in a subdivision if it's all electric. And people who insist on gas for things like cooking can use propane, and you don't use that much energy for cooking, so propane refill will last you a long time.
Great. Excellent questions, and really nice job responding to those, you all. Let's move the slide deck ahead here and just sort of provide a few final thoughts. So electrification can mean innovation and opportunities. We think beneficial electrification is the framework to help sort through those opportunities. And the best thing that regulators could do to get only beneficial electrification is to adopt that three-part test. We encourage you to analyze your local conditions, because it's really, one thing we found out is it's really hard to nail down very general sorts of conclusions given various types of housing, the various climate factors in the regions around the country. So analyze local conditions and trends, and ID opportunities and barriers, consider piloting, and consider educating consumers. Next slide, please. I want to point out that we have a few resources related to beneficial electrification that we'd like to share with you. You see them here. Those are live links. When you get your slide deck, you'll be able to use those. And I'd like to thank Jim Lazar and Jessica Shipley, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate your participation and, as I said, the excellent questions you provided. So what we're going to do is formally close right now our 60-minute webinar, and as I mentioned, for those who want to stay on the line, we will continue to answer questions for another 30 minutes. But thank you all for participating today. I really appreciate it. Okay, well, let's continue with these questions. I'm tossing this out to either of you. What do you think of the high efficiency split system heat pumps claims to operate efficiently at temperatures as low as -15 Fahrenheit?
Well, heat pump technologies are improving. We're told by technology experts who know a lot about heat pumps that this is feasible, what this question describes, but probably, again, only for buildings that are well insulated and up to kind of current building efficiency code. So for new construction, that seems feasible, and these technologies continue to improve. So the picture will continue to change as that happens. It also seems wise to have a backup source of heating if temperatures are, down to -15 degrees Fahrenheit. Those are my thoughts. Jim, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, there are a couple of companies now marketing an integrated space and water heating heat pump that provides both your space heating and your hot water, and I expect in the future they will also provide the chiller energy for freezers and refrigerators and have a complete integrated thermal system for homes. And once we get to that point, the capital costs of building for example, the CO2 based heat pumps, which have very, very high performance but relatively high acquisition costs, that if we can spread it across 3 or more end uses, it may be that integrated system that can perform very well at very cold temperatures is going to become a real product in the marketplace, and I hope it does.
Thank you, Jim. We had a question. Why don't you show ground source heat pumps as viable for existing homes? New York and the Northeast, we do many conversions to ground source heat pumps in existing homes.
Ground source heat pumps are pretty doggone expensive. We do include them as options. It may be that we should have included them as a retrofit option. They can provide very high efficiency heating, very high efficiency cooling, and very high efficiency hot water to homes. And so the technology is excellent. The primary resources we relied on showed them as sufficiently high cost that doing the in-ground part of the installation was dramatically cheaper at the time of new construction.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Is there a difference in the operational degradation of natural gas furnaces, water heaters, over operational lifetimes when compared to their electric heating pump alternatives?
That question is probably beyond the expertise of anybody in RAP. We understand the economics, we understand the policy, we understand how the utility systems operate, but none of us are mechanical engineers or experts in to that level of detail.
Okay, thank you. Can you opine as to the best incentives for residential retrofits?
Well, I think the most important time to look at a electrification and time of in a retrofit application is when the house needs to buy a new air conditioner. That's the moment at which the utility incentive to get the customer to install a heat pump with very efficient heating capability is only a relatively small incremental cost over the cost of replacing the air conditioner. That's the idea, the issue that occurs to me. Jess, do you have another?
Yeah, I mean, so we touched on some ideas for strategies around incentive programs, and so I would encourage people to take a look at the paper because we elaborate more there. But going back to sort of revisiting the existing incentives, so look at your existing programs across all fuels and see if there's an incentive that might be drowning out any potential savings that customers could get by switching to electric. So, perhaps altering the existing programs is one way to just make incentives more even. Another thing that we suggest thinking about in the paper are early retirement programs. So often a furnace fails during the season when it is needed. So the replacement is, going to be an emergency situation where you need a new furnace. It leaves the customer with very few alternatives. They pretty much have to just replace it with the same technology. So an early replacement program can start to identify older equipment stock and give people incentives to switch their furnaces out during the off-season when contractors have more availability, and just avoid that emergency situation and give them the opportunity to evaluate potential cost-saving opportunities from electrification.
Thank you. Couldn't widespread electrification of space heating increase winter peak? And do you see a role for dual fuel air source heat pumps mitigating that effect?
Definitely electrification can increase winter peaks. It will increase winter peaks. In the southern tier states, that's not a very big challenge. Many of those states have lower off-season rates to begin with, or many of them have inclining block rates in summer but not in winter that make electrification more attractive already before they move to more sophisticated time-varying rate designs. But in northern tier states, there's a number of states that have winter peaks now, the Pacific Northwest and interior of New England. That's going to be a very important consideration because the incremental infrastructure costs go up quite a bit, and electrification will be less attractive in areas where that's the case.
I would just add that just to flag for folks a resource that the National Renewable Energy Lab, the electrification future study that they're doing, it does look at this question, and it breaks it down by state, shows how not only how peak demand might change depending on what you assume about electrification, but also how the top hours in the year change between seasons. So if it goes from being more summer peaking to more winter peaking, and in the future studies, I believe they're going to be looking at the implications of that and also the benefits of using flexible load to mitigate some of those implications. So I think that's a useful place for folks to go for some more data and analysis on that question.
Great, thank you.
For example, the Fort Collins rate that I showed earlier, the winter peak period is a different set of hours than the summer peak period. They're both in the late afternoon, but they're not exactly the same hours. And the nature of their costs is that they're trying to make power cheap when the system is comfortable in capacity and much more expensive when it's not. And that's going to vary from state to state, utility to utility, and region to region.
Thank you. Customer perception or misperception is a huge barrier. There's a strong impression that gas is cheaper, more efficient, cleaner, better. Some utilities have been given regulatory approval to educate consumers on the benefits of EVs, but many regulators prohibit encouraging fuel switching. How should customer education be addressed, and by whom, if not by utilities?
Regulators and energy offices are going to have to be a part of this to determine, first of all, what is in the public interest, how to make sure it is also in the consumer interest, if it's in the public interest, and that's where incentive mechanisms may come into play. And it won't always be beneficial. And regulators need to make sure that customers are not being sold a product or service that's genuinely not in the public interest. And at that point, the consumer protection offices of the states should probably have a role in the kinds of changes that are appropriate in each state.
Thanks, Jim. Based on an earlier answer that you gave on more efficient natural gas plants, considering this, is it still beneficial, beyond integrating renewables, for places such as California to electrify heating?
I think it probably is. In California, a lot of that heating energy will come from wind and solar and geothermal resources in the future. And so the environmental effects will be mitigated. As I indicated, they think they can get to about 50% electrification before they swap over becoming a winter peaking region, which is a transition point at which infrastructure costs become pretty significant. But it's only going, I mean, the focus should be on new construction, and at the time of major heating system replacement, I don't see very many places where an early retirement program is going to be economically attractive.
Okay. How do ISO, generation fuel adequacy, security, and price concerns fit in here? Could it become a bet on the come, quote unquote, on renewables?
David, I'm going to hand this back to you after I say a few words, but I do think it is a bit of a bet on the come. I grew up in Las Vegas, so gambling terms are familiar to me. And you're gambling that the low-cost renewables really will be there, and therefore electricity prices really will go up slower than natural gas prices or oil or propane prices, or may even, and I think will, come down, at least in real terms. And, the probability of that working is very high in the Northwest, the Southwest, and I think the South, where wind and solar are very attractive resources. And in the upper Midwest, where wind is an incredibly attractive and low-cost resource. But there may be some parts of the country where where that's going to be less true. Dave, do you have some thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, I would observe that some sources of this information, for instance, BNF, when they look across the globe at the prices of renewables this last year, or when we look at the all requirements bid that was issued by Xcel last year, we're looking at very low prices. Those were Xcel's prices were 2 and 3 cents for wind and solar, 10-year contracts, flat prices. That was it. The risk, the risk associated with escalating prices, the effects of the tax credits going away were all incorporated in those very low-cost bids. I think, as one of our questioners noted, that it's important to keep track also of the other side of the ledger. In other words, if there's leakage in the transmission and distribution systems of natural gas infrastructure, that should be accounted for. I would also note that during the preparation of the Clean Power Plan, that EPA was very charitable when they looked at the global warming potential of methane as a factor of 20 over carbon. They looked at that's a 100-year global warming potential factor. When you consider that methane stays in the environment for around 20 years, and you look at EPA for the global warming potential factor for 20 years, it's between 85 and 88. So a small amount of leakage times that amount of global warming potential really changes the balances when you look at these opportunities for lower cost renewables and other resources.
Yeah, the lower cost renewables are happening all over the world. CFE, the National Electric Utility in Mexico, has taken in solar at less than 2 cents a kilowatt hour, wind at less than 3 cents. In the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, solar is coming in at under 2 cents a kilowatt hour. In India, wind is coming in at 2 cents a kilowatt hour. So these are not unique to places in the United States where developers have access to our federal tax credits. Even on an unsubsidized basis, we're beginning to see some extremely attractive prices for new renewables, and the future is going to belong, as Jess has talked about, the future is going to belong to flexible loads, to the ability to preheat with using smart thermostat technologies, thermal storage systems, both hot and cold, summer and winter, storage systems, and battery costs are also coming down, and that's a part of the seismic shift that we're seeing. Nevada Energy's newest announced contract for storage, cheaper than the cost of a peaker unit, and you can put it exactly where you need it on the distribution system, so that it also provides transmission and distribution capacity benefits. There's an awful lot of change coming.
Thanks, Jim. Do we have guidance for city green building codes to encourage electric space heating?
Well, I think one important first step is to look at whether there are barriers in existing codes, so prohibitions on electric resistance heating, for example. Maybe another idea would be to think about developing home energy use metrics that use overall energy use or even emissions efficiency to determine what qualifies as a green building. Those are just a couple ideas off the top of my head, but Jim, do you have any?
The one that occurs to me is to adequately consider the supplemental heating sources that may be installed in a building in sizing the HVAC equipment for that building. Building codes generally require that the heating system be able to heat all of the heated spaces to a certain temperature with unattended operation. And when we installed a new furnace in our house, some years ago, we insisted on taking into account the 30,000 BTUs that our gas fireplace could deliver in the equation to put in a smaller furnace with a quieter fan system, knowing that on the coldest days of the year we would have to turn on the gas fireplace. But the gas fireplace is a efficient, heat-rated item, and there's, in the 5 years since we did that, I think we've maybe needed that on 2 days for supplemental heat, but we were able to save a whole bunch of money on the furnace installation and get a quieter system by doing that. As we start having more storage heating systems and supplemental heating systems in homes, it's going to be important to take those into account in the appliance sizing, because that's going to be where some of the economic savings to pay for this will come from.
Thank you. We got an interesting piece of information there. We were talking about programs that acknowledge that are willing to look at the switching between different types of fuel. And we mentioned the Mass Save program, and one of our listeners said that the idea of allowing for fuel switching that's proposed for the next 3-year plan for Mass Save, it has yet to be approved by the DPU. Going through these questions, are there any strategies local planning or building department can adopt to support the switch to electrification to retrofit residential and commercial properties?
I think there are a number of things that building departments can do. At the top of the list, making sure that the building community understands all of the costs that are being incurred when 2 different energy systems are installed into a subdivision, into a neighborhood. Those building departments that are within the same city as municipal utilities, places like Los Angeles, Sacramento, Austin, Jacksonville, and smaller municipalities all over the country, can actually do a little bit of coordination between the building department and the utility department to make sure that when a building permit is applied for, that the customer is referred to the efficiency and fuel choice staff at the municipal utility to make sure they're considering all of the best options. There's generally less coordination in private utility service territories between the building department and the utility planning staff, but maybe there's some good opportunities for regulators to encourage that kind of cooperation in private utility service territories as well. Yes?
Yeah, I think just going back to a point you were making earlier, Jim, about building codes, when you do a major remodel, there's different codes that the building has to comply with. You have to bring the building up to fire and electrical code, and one thing to think about is whether if the building also had to come up to energy code, the building itself would be much more energy efficient, which would improve the economics and the effectiveness and produce better outcomes for the consumer by switching to electric. We've also heard that the permitting process for installing heat pumps is slowing progress in some areas, even where there are incentives for consumers to switch to heat pumps. So, is there a way to make permitting move more expeditiously? That would be a question that I would throw out there to local planners and building departments.
Thank you. There are inspection costs that the builder or homeowner will save by having only a single energy system in the house at the time of a remodel. I think would be an interesting thing to quantify.
Yeah, great point. In order to avoid replacement of aging, leaky gas mains, you need switching of 100% off of the load off gas and to abandon service to the area. Is that a reasonable goal of an integrated gas electric IRP?
I think it can be a reasonable goal if it's looking far enough ahead in time so that there's actually time to move customers onto either electric appliances or onto delivered fuel appliances. I'm not sure I'm ready to give up my gas range, but I think I could give up every other gas appliance in my house and the 10-gallon propane cylinder will last me months for cooking. So moving to a delivered fuel for that one end use may be fine. I have had friends tell me that as soon as I try an induction range, I'll change my mind and want to have an electric range also. But I think that it's a very important question that's been asked is, where literally at some point you create a cliff where there's no longer gas flowing and everybody has to have every appliance that was using gas converted to some other, some other fuel, even if just rejetting it for propane. There's a in-the-house cost and then the cost of a delivered fuel to consider. So I think that the integrated gas and electric resource planning needs to be looking far enough ahead to look at when renewals and replacements will be needed, how expensive they will be, and if there are areas to consider abandonment. Well, we have an example of this in the telecommunications area. The traditional wireline phone companies have lost so much of their business, more than 60% of their access lines, to other services to handle data and voice, that they are abandoning very large parts of their service territory, particularly in rural parts of the country. And the federal lifeline system that originally provided subsidies for low-income wireline service has moved to primarily providing financial assistance for low-income wireless service. So we've seen a utility industry that has lost much of its market and abandoned parts of its service territory, and I think we can learn from that experience. And most state regulators have been through it with the telecom companies.
Thanks, Jim. In a transition to greater electrification in transportation and in buildings, do you have recommendations about avoiding the gouging and gold plating of utility capital investments that were widespread during the nuclear plant heyday?
Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty is the phrase that comes to mind. Regulators need to continuously monitor what utilities are doing to assure that they're making cost-effective choices. The integrated resource planning process is a good place to do that. All sources procurement programs are competitive procurement programs for new resources are a good way to do that. We've certainly learned a lot about measurement verification of utility expenditures over the last 3-4 decades since the period that the question addressed. We've gotten far better at regulation, and as a result, the electricity cost as a percentage of household income has dropped quite dramatically over that time.
Thanks, Jim. I'm going to give you all one more question. Please explain what PUCs and IUO utilities need to do to decide in order to deploy capital quickly on this.
I think that question goes really well with the one that Jim just answered, which it gets to identifying state goals, what you want to achieve, and then what the PUC's role is in helping to achieve those goals. One other thing to add to what Jim just said is in most states, PUCs don't allow utilities to undertake activities that could be viewed as load building. So electrification programs that pursue switching to heat pumps would almost certainly fall into that definition. So one suggestion is to rethink or revisit requirements around that for utilities. I don't know, Jim, do you have anything to add?
I think it's going to be a relatively slow transition in this area. I don't think many regulators are ready to invite load building, but a few are, and I think we will learn from those examples. The focus, I think, is and should be initially on new construction, where avoiding the entire infrastructure build-out is an opportunity. That on the retrofit side, the economics are not as attractive. From the consumer perspective, the economics are not as attractive from a total system perspective, and I think the transition will be slower. I hope during that time, and I expect during that time, that the efficiency of electric appliances will continue to improve, and that the consumer economics of retrofit will become more attractive over time.
Listen, thank you both, Jessica and Jim, for great answers, and all of you who have stuck it out with us here for 90 minutes for doing that and for providing such good questions. As I mentioned earlier on, we will be getting a link to this presentation and a copy of the slides. If you find that useful, please feel free to submit any questions that you have or any follow-up inquiries with us at RAP. As I mentioned, you can get our contact information on our website. And with that, thank you all for participating, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.